I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. May I ask those that have served in uniform to remain standing. The rest may be seated. Thank you. Thank you for our freedom. Wow. So here we are today, approaching the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II with a group of distinguished individuals. How many original members do we have with us today?
Oh, yeah. You said original.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for all you've done. Not only what you did as young folks, giving everything that you did, but also for continuing on and perpetuating the history so that I've got a 4-year-old, so that the generations that come after appreciate what it is that you sacrificed and did for us. So thank you. Thank you for this organization. Thank you for sharing your history with us. I don't have the words. So how about one more big hand for all that World War II generation, the greatest generation. So of course we're going to hear today from John Luckadoo, who's here with us, but we also get to hear today from Chris Barrett, the 100th Bomb Group Foundation Director. I'm going to turn things over to Chris. Chris, thank you so much for being here today and sharing with us. The Palm Springs Air Museum's mission is to preserve, educate, and honor. We've got a B-17. The whole purpose of having it here is not to have a shiny thing that people don't know about and can't learn from. Thank you guys for doing what it is that you do and perpetuating your family's history and sharing it with us. So why don't you come on up and tell us the things that everybody needs to know.
Thank you so much, Greg. Well, while Greg is setting up the first slide deck, I just want to say on behalf of the 100th Bomb Group Foundation, welcome to Palm Springs Air Museum. We are pleased that you've made this part of your day. It's a fun thing for us to gather here year after year as part of our own veterans group, but to see that there is this larger community of folks who are willing to turn out and hear our stories, we are more than eager to share them. And if you saw any of our preliminary advertisement, or even if you are just happy to sit down after you've spent the morning looking at airplanes, we're glad that you're here. We're going to share a few of our favorite stories. And we chose this idea of explaining the name that's associated with the 100th Bomb Group, probably more than any other name, becoming the Bloody 100th. We'd like to unpack a little bit of that story. 77 years ago, there were 4 squadron leaders, there were 36 combat crews, and they took off from the United States on Memorial Day weekend, headed for Europe. A lot of those young men, most in their early 20s, thought they'd be home by Christmas. That really wasn't the reality that they encountered, but by Halloween, by mid-October of 1943, they had acquired a new nickname, and that's what you see up there on the screen. So while I am excited to be sharing this floor space today with John Luckadoo, who was one of those original fellows, and we probably have at least one other original fellow who was there on those initial crossings that we'll see here today too. So we'll get into this and tell a little bit of our story. First of all, I have to do some acknowledgement. There's my wife covering her eyes in the back. Full disclosure, I married into the 100th Bomb Group. It was a very feminine connection that I have. My wife and her grandmother told me about her grandmother's younger brother. It took me nearly 35 years to unpack some of that story. But somebody I need to especially acknowledge is the man Russ Engel, who was another one of those original 100th crew members. That's Russ up there. 5 years ago, that photo crossed my computer screen, and I was amazed because I knew what that gravesite was. That's the American Cemetery in Mattingly, near Cambridge, England. And I know who's buried there. It's my wife's great-uncle Harry Eddyburn. I had seen Russ's name in the history books, had no idea that Russ Engel was still alive. So I looked up his number, I took a deep breath, called, and his son David answered. And I explained, I'm a family member of one of the 100th Bob Group early crews from Squawk and Hawk. And I have some letters that mention you that you might like to have. And his son David said, you have the right place. They invited me to my very first gathering here at Palm Springs Air Museum. And it's to Russ, I want to say thank you. Russ left us quietly just 5 months ago at age 101. But he has shared stories. My friend Lucky has filled in a lot of the blanks. We had a big missing chapter in our family history. And maybe the same is true for many of you out there. You're trying to understand what was that all about. Or maybe you are just naturally curious saying, you know, World War II may have ended 75 years ago, as Greg said. But in many ways, our world still is wrestling with and coming to terms with all that that meant. We want to share a little of the story of the men of the 100th, and I'm going to do it through really two crews. One is the Squawk and Hawk crew. Officially, they were crew number 9 of those 36 that were sent over in May of 1943. This is a composite image. My friend David Engel had it made because so far we just haven't found an elusive actual photo of the full crew. 3 of the guys are photoshopped in there. But this is taken on hard stand number 14 over at Thorpe Abbott's, England in October of 1943. The other crew is what we could call the Sunny crew. It's Lucky's crew. And that tall gentleman over on the far right is none other than Mr. Luckadoo. Crew number 25, yes. Just to give you some perspective, because you can start throwing out a lot of dates and a lot of stories, and to help you connect the dots, I'll just put this up there to give you some sense of the stories we're sharing largely took place between November of 1942, when the 100th Bomb Group really first came into being. The first personnel were assigned and started their training. 1943 was the very pivotal year where they entered combat after 7 months of training. 7 months is a very unusually long time for a group to be trying to come together. And then we want to wrap up sort of the rest of the story of those original crews close to May of 1944. A little background though, in 1942, particularly in the summer of 1942, I'd like to borrow a phrase from my friend Captain John Clark, who is another member of the 100th Bomb Group who's here today and served as a co-pilot a little bit later in the war. He uses the phrase that these young men of the 100th Bomb Group were the air-minded generation. I think that's a wonderful phrase that describes boys who grew up with Charles Lindbergh as their hero and the bright, shiny new technology of the day represented in the B-17 bomber and the B-24 Liberator. But Hollywood was in the picture. We were gearing up as a nation for war. Warner Brothers was out there helping make recruiting films, promoting the war. One of the things I found in the personal effects of the crew that we've accumulated was this little newspaper clipping from Chicago that said, local youth, Sumner Reader, appears in one of these Hollywood Warner Brothers movies, Men of the Sky. You probably haven't seen it. It's actually out there on DVD, not on the internet from what I can tell. But you'd have to be very quick to find out which person in there is Sumner. It was filmed at the California Air Base where Sumner was training in the summer of 1942 as a pilot. And it's interesting because of the letters I have. I know that Sumner was living in one of those little pyramid tents. The life of a pilot trainee went through a number of phases. And the final phase ended up being an assignment to a combat unit. And you entered a new phase, I guess what was called combat training. And if everything went well, the plan was that you spent your first 30 days at one base learning some things, the next 30 days at another base stateside, the third set of 30 days at another base, and then you were sent overseas. That was the plan. I'll quote John Clark again, because he has some good analogies. He said, you know, in 1943, the Army Air Force really was learning as you go. He says, it's a little bit like writing a play, rehearsing it, and performing it all in the same day. And that's what was going on. And I think you're going to hear from John Luckadoo as he tells what it was like to be in that learn as you go mode. So here we are, 1942, November, and the first crews of the 100th Bomb Group have been assembled at Boise, Idaho. They were transferred out of a sort of feeder group called the 29th Bomb Group, and the 100th Bomb Group came into being just a few days before November of 1942. Two of the pilots that were assigned during that first 30-day period that they were coming together were Sumner Reeder. You see him on the left with his bride of about a month, Evelyn. On the other side, you see Glenn Dye, who was already married and a father. Two of the original pilots of the 100th Bomb Group. And they were assigned crews who began training. And remember, the goal was to get through training in about 90 days and go to combat. At the same time, in February of 1943, close to the end of that 90 days, when the 100th Bomb Group should have been getting ready to cross the Atlantic and go to England, we had Harry Eddie Byrne on the left and John Luckadoo down in Georgia, near Valdosta, at a pilot training field, getting ready to earn their wings. They were members of the class of 43B. And Lucky, if there's anything you'd like us to hear a little bit about the class of 43B, I've been privileged to hear a few of your stories. If you'd like to take the mic and offer us some perspective of what it was like to be a student in pilot training, I know these folks would enjoy them as much as I've enjoyed them.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon. I want you to know how happy I am to be here. I'm happy to be in here. Next month, the 16th of March, I will be 98 years old. And to have lived that long and be fortunate enough to be here today with you is a joy, a privilege, and an honor. Thank you so much for having me. My nickname is Lucky, and when I look back over my almost 98 years, I think I should be called darn lucky because of the good fortune that I have experienced in being a member of the original 100th Bomb Group, to have fought the great battle of the European Air War and survived. Because our survival rate was one of the major reasons why we became known as the Bloody Hundredth. Now, many of you know that to the British, the word bloody means a lot of different things. It's bloody this and bloody that. Usually it's good. And hopefully that's what they meant when they started referring to us as the Bloody Hundredth. But when we arrived in England in late May and early June of 1943, we were just kids. Hairy-headed college kids in our early 20s. And we didn't really care whether school kept or not. But believe you me, when we joined the Army Air Corps and learned to fly and were thrust into combat to defeat the Germans, the Nazi regime, and to prevent them, to help the British from being invaded, we sobered up and matured overnight. This picture you see was me in primary school in 1942 in Avon Park, Florida. I went from primary and to basic in Sumter, South Carolina, and then, as Chris has already told you, I graduated in class 43B, which meant in February. The B stood for the second month of the year. 43B from Valdosta, Georgia, Moody Field. Strangely enough, 40 of us from my twin-engine flight training in Valdosta were immediately sent to join the 100th Bomb Group, heavy B-17 outfit in Kearney, Nebraska. This did not happen in any other group, ever. They took 40 of my classmates and me, straight out of flying school now, and assigned us to this group as co-pilots. Now the group, in the meantime, if you follow the chronology, had already been through combat training, which was called phase training. They went through 3 phases of navigation, instrument flying, formation flying, night flying, all of the other things, gunnery. They'd already been through that, and prior to being sent overseas, they were given a final check ride, which was to consist of a mock raid over San Francisco from Kearney in formation to prove to the Inspector General that they were qualified and certified for combat experience. En route, they encountered heavy weather, and the group split up. 2 managed to make it, one managed to make it to Virginia, the other to Tennessee, and the commanding officer landed in Las Vegas. Needless to say, they flunked. But my classmates and I were suddenly plucked out. Our predecessor co-pilots were plucked out and checked out and sent to different groups with new crews. And we were put into a B-17 we'd never been in before. We'd never flown anything larger than a twin-engine aircraft when we were suddenly put in this position. Well, the Inspector General said, "You're not certified for combat. You guys have no air discipline." So they split the group up and sent each squadron to a different air base to be instructors for those who were going over. That lasted about 3 weeks. The press for heavy bomber groups in Europe was so heavy that we were called back together again, reassembled in Kearney, issued brand new B-17s, and said, "You're going overseas regardless. You're going to be killed anyway, so you might as well go now." So I think that I had perhaps 25 hours in a B-17 when we left the States. We departed from Bangor, Maine, and flew to Gander Lake, Newfoundland, where we had to wait a favorable tailwind in order to make the non-stop 12-hour flight from Gander to Prestwick, Scotland. The winds eventually changed and the group started taking off. In the meanwhile, the pilot to whom I had been assigned in Glendive in our crew was number 25 out of the 36, and Sumner Reader's crew was number 9. But my pilot got itchy and he went across the base and shacked up with a WAF and got a raging case of VD. So they threw him in the hospital. The rest of the group proceeded, and my crew, singly, sat and cooled our heels for 2 weeks while he healed. Now in those days, the only thing they had to treat venereal disease with was sulfa. And by the time he was released, he was so weak he couldn't stand. He'd been flat on his back for 2 weeks, and he was so weak we had to load him into the airplane. So he said, "Lucky, you're going to have to fly because I can't." So I flew us to combat. As inexperienced as I was thrust in that position, and you never know what you can do until you have to do it. Right? So we eventually got to Prestwick. Meanwhile, the group had landed in England, and because Thorpe Abbott's, our future home, was not completed. It was built especially for the 100th Bomb Group, but had not been completed by the British. They were sent temporarily to an alternate base at Pottington. But by the time we finally caught up with them, they were ensconced at Thorpe Abbott's, and so we joined the group there 2 weeks later. This was in June of 1943, mind you. Axis Sally came on the radio immediately and welcomed us by name to the European Air War, and said, "We know that Colonel Turner has brought you here, but this isn't your war. You don't have any business here. Your girlfriends and wives back in the States are being romanced by 4Fers, and you're going to be darn sorry you came. But as long as you're here, we're going to teach you a lesson." And I'm here to testify they did. A bitter lesson. We were on one of our first practice missions. Got out over the English Channel and were jumped by the Luftwaffe and lost 3 crews, 30 men, and we hadn't even entered combat. We soon learned that when we did enter combat that we were being confronted by an extremely experienced and highly qualified Air Force. The German Air Force had been in operation for 4 years prior to our reaching England. Their backs were to the wall. They were fighting for their homeland. We were 6,000 miles away. So it really wasn't our war. But after Pearl Harbor, of course, we were involved, deeply involved, in both the Pacific and the European theaters. So the air war became our war. And I think if I were to encapsulate for one word that our experience exemplifies, it's a 4-letter word, COLD. At high altitude, in broad daylight, in mass formation, we were experiencing temperatures of minus 50 to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. You have never been that cold. You can see the heavy equipment that we had to wear on the mannequin under the wing here of the B-17. We did everything we could to withstand that very bitter cold, which severely impacted our capabilities of function at high altitude. Many of you are aware that we were flying unpressurized aircraft. So in order to survive at those altitudes, we had to be on oxygen. We usually donned it about 10,000 feet as we continued on our climb. So that inhibited us to some extent from the get-go. And it was not only uncomfortable, but it was very, very inhibiting. And one of the ironies was that as a pilot, in the heat of battle, when you're in flying formation and desperately trying to maintain your relative position, watching all the instruments, the flak is coming up in sheets and in volume. And the Luftwaffe's flying through the formation, planes are going down, all hell is breaking loose. You suddenly discover that you're sweating, perspiring, and that perspiration, that moisture, under those conditions, freezes instantly. So you suddenly find your oxygen mask being blocked by ice crystals. And you're having to crack those up with one hand, fly the airplane with the other. So it was anything but a picnic.
So Lucky has just put you in the cockpit of the B-17. And let me give you a little interlude to just point out a couple of things that Lucky described to you. Those new airplanes that they received on the States, ironically, these two crews were sequentially serial numbered. Squawk and Hawk was 88, and Sunny was 89. And when they came over and landed, the crews and the planes were typically assigned a sort of permanent hard stand location where they parked. The red arrow shows where Squawk and Hawk parked, along the eastern border of Thorpe Babbitt's airfield. And the yellow arrow shows where Lucky and Glenn Dye's crew had their aircraft parked adjacent to the control tower museum at Thorpe Babbitt's. This is a good time for me to put in a plug to say that in many ways Thorpe Babbitt's is the heart of the 100th story these days. It's a place where you can go and visit. Ron and Carol Batley are here. They have dedicated their life to being curators of the museum, the 100th Bomb Group Memorials Museum at Thorpe Babbitt's, and we're grateful to them. They have embraced us like family. So this is a few of the scenes of Thorpe Babbitt's during wartime. Zooming in just a little bit, this is the sort of configuration of huts, the Nissen huts. where the men lived and bunked. There was sort of commentary that said, you know, those Air Corps guys have it nice. They get to come home and sleep in clean sheets and have a warm meal. I don't know. One of the stories I've heard is you had to ride your bike just to get a shower because they didn't have shower rooms and things near where the men lived. This is a picture of Russ standing outside the front door of his barracks at the site where the 349th Squadron officers bunked. And you can see the ubiquitous bikes parked everywhere. The story was that whatever bike you rode and parked among the dozens and dozens outside the mess hall wasn't necessarily the same bike that you brought home. One other little interesting custom that is of the airmen, and I think there's an exhibit here in the Museum of Short Snorters. If you look, you'll find it. Among Harry Eddyburn's memorabilia from World War II, I found this silver certificate dollar bill with names written on it, and it said Short Snorter. You might want to look that up if you want to really understand the original intent of a short snorter. It did predate the Army Air Corps in World War II, but the young flyers of 1943 used these short snorters as sort of an interesting artifact. Harry's was just this one bill. There are 14 names on it, but Lucky, I know you have something that looks different than this one.
How many of you have ever seen a short snorter? This has been laminated, but the object of it was to take a piece of currency from a base or a locale or a country and have all of your teammates sign it, date it, and add it to others as you went. And you had to carry this on your person at all times, or else you had to buy the drinks for the crowd. So we made it a habit of trying to catch guys in the shower. But this was one of the idiosyncrasies that we practiced. We found some solace in any kind of thing that could lighten the mood a little bit from the very serious business that we were engaged in. But very few of these still exist. John, do you still have your short story? So I just wanted to add that to your vast fund of useless information.
Now, what he did allude to was the serious business of what between June 1943 and really October of 1943 was one of those experimental rehearsal periods of the air war strategy. Maximum effort missions unescorted into German airspace. One of the most prominent of the maximum effort raids that the 100th Bomb Group participated in occurred on August 17th. It was the mission to Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The 100th group flew the leg that went to Regensburg, and the objective was to knock out ball bearings production. The whole strategy was based on let's bomb strategically. We're not just trying to wipe out the population, we're trying to disable their ability to practice and wage war. Regensburg was a hub of ball bearing manufacturing in Germany at the time. From headquarters, one of the staff officers, Lieutenant Colonel Bernie Lay, flew as an observer with the 100th Bomb Group on that Regensburg mission. Lucky's group didn't fly. The reader crew in Swackenhaupt did go up, but they were a spare. That meant that 21 planes from the 100th group were in a formation chart scheduled to cross the English Channel and head to Regensburg. But typically, if by the time you got to the English Channel and you found you were having mechanical difficulties and you had to drop out of formation, there were also some spare aircraft assigned to be ready to fill in so that you could have your maximum effort force in your group with all the other groups. This maximum effort raid in the 100th history stands out because 9 of the 21 fortresses that the 100th sent up that day were lost. And it actually took days before everybody knew who was coming back, because this was not a raid to Germany and back. They went to Germany and then they kept going. They crossed the Mediterranean and went down into Africa and landed, reconfigured, refueled, and the remaining planes came back. There are notes out on our 100th Bomb Group Foundation website that you can read some of the first-hand accounts of what it was like to be waiting there at the base, or what it was like to participate on that mission. But because our topic today was becoming the Bloody 100th, this is one of those stepping stones that earned the 100th Bomb Group the reputation that said, the Luftwaffe must have it in for this group. And there were certain legends and myths that have been debunked. Lucky, I checked with you the other night and I said, tell me, was there any truth to this idea that the German fighters could look for the big square D on the tail of the B-17 and say, aha, it's the 100th Bomb Group, we're going to get you?
Well, one of the myths that exists to this day about the Bloody 100th is that on this particular mission, one of the crews left the formation due to battle damage, and there was sort of an unwritten agreement between us and the Luftwaffe that if you realized you could not make it back to your home base, you could give up, you could surrender. And by lowering the landing gear, this was a signal that you were surrendering. So the German fighters, instead of shooting you down, then would come up on either side of you and escort you to the nearest aerodrome. You would land and be captured and become a POW and survive. The myth about our group, 100 Bomb Group, is that on this mission, one of the crews did lower its landing gear and did signify that it was going to surrender. And when the German fighters came up on either side, the gunners shot them down. That never happened. It has been proven by a Britisher, Martin Middleback, that the crew that supposedly did that committed that awful sin, wasn't even in that area and couldn't have done this. But the story goes that because it was a 100 Bomb Group airplane, that we were marked forever as targets for the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe has admitted, the fighter pilots that opposed us, have admitted that they couldn't tell the difference from one group to the other. And they didn't care. They were out to knock down bombers. And the closest bomber, or the one that was most vulnerable because they had to leave the formation, was going to be their first target. Why? Because knocking down a bomber took 10 men out of the war, whereas knocking down a fighter only took out one. Consequently, they flew until they were killed. They didn't have tours. So they went after the bombers and got double credit for every bomber that they killed. But they did not focus on the 100 Bomb Group, contrary to belief and lore.
So we just wanted to dispel that part of the myth. If you came here thinking, oh, he's just going to tell us about the myths that earned us this nickname, not so. You've already seen that there was some irregularity in the formation, the training, the long period, and Lucky talked about how the original crews actually weren't combat ready. He said they flunked, and they had to have those replacement co-pilots brought in. It's interesting, I just wanted to give credit because I don't know if Al Freitas is here. He's one of our other 100th original cadre bomb group members. And we were at dinner and at a round table last night with Al, and he recounted his being part of this Regensburg mission. Let me fast forward a little bit because as Lucky said, the goal was to knock down bombers. And you already know that Lucky flew Sonny over there. And here we have a picture of Sonny looking decidedly airworthy. On September 3rd, the Glendive crew was not on the schedule to make a raid, which was headed near Paris. Another fellow named Richard King took up Sonny. It was an available aircraft. The goal is to put up as many aircraft as you can. Unfortunately, Sonny took a flak burst right in midships. And the story is that they were able to make a wheels-up landing, this other pilot, Richard King, but as soon as the plane came down on the ground in France, it exploded. It's amazing that 3 people ended up in prison camps and 1 successfully evaded. That means that person somehow escaped capture and through the underground network was able to return to base in England. September 6th was another maximum effort raid, and this one was to Stuttgart. It was going to be a lot like that Regensburg raid. And this was the briefing route. Now, they didn't have Google Maps like I did, but this was part of the routine of a mission day. You got up and you went to the bathroom and you went to breakfast and then you went to briefing. The route for the mission to Stuttgart, which Lucky and the Glendive crew also were in formation fly, was this. They essentially formed up a little to the east of the red dot up there that represents Thorpe Abbots, and then they flew south to Dungeness, one of the closest points of land across the English Channel, and their route was going to take them across France, and then they were going to take a right turn and head to Stuttgart. Unfortunately, that day, the weather did not cooperate, and the farther they flew across France, the more the clouds accumulated until the time the very first planes in this huge 333 group armada reached Stuttgart, the ground was totally obscured. Some of the groups went around 3 times before they found an opportunity to bomb. The 100th Bomb Group that day was further back in the bomber train. A decision was made at some point to go and pursue the secondary target. However, at that point, the Squawk and Hawk crew ran into trouble in the nose of their borrowed aircraft because Squawk and Hawk was down for maintenance that day, so they took up an unnamed aircraft. It was just a new plane that had come across the ocean as a replacement. The Reader crew climbed in. Pete DeLeo was the bombardier in the plexiglass nose, Russ Engel, the navigator, right behind him. And as they were attacked by swarms of Focke-Wulf fighters near Stuttgart, they're blazing away with their guns, the top turret's going, the ball turret and the bottom is going forward, and suddenly somebody hears through the interphone, "Here they come." The German fighters had swung around and had turned and were coming head on at the Reader crew. Lucky was flying in the same formation elsewhere, and as he said, it was an opportunistic sort of attack by the Germans. They knew they couldn't knock out that whole formation, but their objective was to get as many bombers as they could. Cannon shells from the Focke-Wulfs, they're shown on the next slide. They were bigger than what we were firing at them. We fired 50 caliber. I think they were firing 20 millimeter, right? Two of the cannon shells entered the nose, exploded. Both Pete and Russ were so severely wounded bleeding profusely. Both of them had lost the right eye. Pete was partially paralyzed and stunned. Russ was surprisingly mobile. He told me that even though his eye was gone and he had shrapnel all through his body, the thing that really hurt worse was a little piece of shrapnel that had gone through his thumbnail. Drive him crazy. He managed to make sure that Pete was bundled up and bandaged while this 45 degree below cold air is rushing through that broken nose. And Russ then decided, I better see what's going on up in the cockpit. Up in the cockpit, there was mayhem. Harry Eddieburn, the co-pilot, was sitting there next to the window. The red arrow shows where the 20mm cannon shell went through his side cockpit window. He was right on the other side of that plexiglass. Sumner Reeder was on the driver's side, if you will, of the aircraft, and he saw Harry slump against the control wheel. You see the German shell here on the right, the bigger one. That went through Harry's shoulder, gave him a compound fracture, exploded against the armor plate that was there for protection behind his seat, and opened an enormous wound in his chest. What Harry did, though, was stay at the controls. He knew that you kind of need two guys to fly these B-17s. It's an exhausting job, and they were only halfway. They hadn't even made it to the target. He knew his duty was to stay at the controls. Sumner Reeder asked the engineer to come and help Harry out of the co-pilot seat and put him down in the hatchway, which is an opening down between the seats of the B-17. If you tour this one, you'll see it. You have to climb up through that little hatchway. Harry was laid down on the plywood board there. He got up 3 times to return to his position until, so weak from loss of blood, he didn't move. Russ Engel climbed over Harry and came up and took a seat in that mangled co-pilot seat. And he called out the readings. He helped Sumner make sure that they were doing everything they could to stay in formation as long as they could. Sumner was faced with the difficult realization that their oxygen had been shot out too. So flying at 25,000 feet over Stuttgart, and now following these other airplanes that are heading to a secondary target back near Paris, faced the tough decision of, I'm going to have to leave formation. And Lucky would tell you that a B-17 away from the formation as a straggler is usually a lost cause. Nevertheless, they had no choice. They dove down to 13,000 feet where there was breathable air, and they spent the next 3.5 hours fighting their way back to England. Being chased by the Luftwaffe the whole time. It must have been a real battle. Not only was it long, not only was Sumner having to wrestle the plane by himself. At one point, the Germans came so close that Sumner flew into a cloud. He managed to make a complete U-turn and come back the other way. And his invasive maneuvers were so extreme that at one point, and this is debated by some, the B-17 executed what is called a split S and came out of it. Russ, by that time, had been removed from the cockpit and was back in the radio room. If you go through the B-17, you know something interesting about the radio room is that the top is open. The top was open, when the plane goes over, Russ, who's survived this nasty attack, nearly goes out the open top of the radio room. These stories were incredible at the time. They were verified to enough of an extent that Harry, Sumner, and Russ all were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for their actions that day, because Sumner Reeder was actually able to bring this airplane back to England. He was without brakes, without oxygen, almost without fuel, and he had to find a place just across the English Channel to let down. And he landed on a grass strip that was being prepared as a practice field for the D-Day invasion, something long enough to put a B-17 down. That was the story of the Squawkin' Hawk crew's last maximum effort. If you picked up a newspaper in September 1943, you would see headlines about forts raid this city, forts pounded this town, forts knocked out these airfields. It was the Squawk and Hawk crew's turn to be in the headlines that day. This one was a write-up from Sumner's debriefing that was turned into a newspaper article, published in Stars and Stripes, picked up by the Associated Press, United Press International, and went worldwide. The same day that news article was published, Harry's mother received a different piece of paper at her front door, a Western Union telegram saying, "The Secretary of War regrets to inform you that your son has been killed in action." Fortunately, not all the news in September was bad. Here's Sonny. We now have Sonny 2 because we saw what happened to the original Sonny. And here is the Glendyke crew with John Luckadoo again on the lower right end. Lucky, you were a rare, you introduced yourself as a rare breed of somebody who's not only here today and survived the war, but to be part of this experience put you almost to being part of that first crew that completed 25 missions.
Well, I did not finish with the Diet crew at the same time for the simple reason that we had a practice when your crew was designated as a lead crew of the formation. The co-pilot was removed and replaced by a command pilot who was in charge of the entire formation. The co-pilot then was designated to go back and fly in the tail gun position. So the first time the Dice crew became a lead crew, I was replaced and told to go fly in the tail gun position. Now mind you, I had never fired a .50 caliber in my life. I had no training, no inkling of what I was to do. But I was designated as the fire control officer for the entire formation in the rear. What somebody who thought this idea up forgot was that the tail gunner can only communicate with the pilot over the intercom. He has no connection or communication with anybody else in the formation. So, innocently, a minute we were under attack, I bore down on the triggers. I guess I froze on the triggers, I don't know. But I burned out both barrels. So for the rest of the mission, I sat there like a nautical hawk, just able to report the attacks as they came in. And they did come in, because at that point, we were experiencing Me-110s, twin-engine fighter bombers from the Luftwaffe that were armed with rockets. And all they had to do was sit out in the rear of the formation, out of gun range, and lob these rockets through our formation. And they were devastating. The Germans quickly developed our vulnerable attack positions. And the first was from the rear with rockets, but the second was because in the F model, which we went over with and flew originally, and this is an F model here, even Sunny 2 was an F model. The top turret gunner could come down to level, and the ball turret gunners' guns could come up level, but it left this void that the Germans could get out and line abreast in front of the formation, 30 or 40 of them, Me-109s, FW-190s, and fly directly through the formation. And you'd look up suddenly and see them with the wings lighting up as their cannons, 20 millimeter cannons, machine guns, and the rockets that they were equipped with were being sprayed through the formation. They would proceed right on through, split us out, come back, reform, and do it again. That was such an effective maneuver that it prompted us to develop the G model of B-17, which had a chin turret with twin caliber 50s underneath the bombardier's nose. And that stopped that type of attack. But their main mission and objective was just to have the flak or the fighter attacks inflict a sufficient amount of damage so that we would be forced out of the formation. And when you could not keep up with the formation and have the mutual protection of the other airplanes, then you were a sitting duck. Your chances of survival were zero. Quite oddly, it so happened that many times we would go out in mass formation and parts of the same squadron would be unscathed, untouched by black warfighters. And for them it was a milk run. While another part of the exact same formation would be devastated. Maybe the whole squadron obliterated. Those were the fortunes of war.
And that's a great lead into what really was one of your most defining missions. We talked about how maximum effort was a strategy. Maximum effort ended its first phase of strategy in October, largely during a period of 7 days, that is now remembered as Black Week. Began on October 8th of 1943 and lasted for the next 7 days until October 14th. Lucky, you were flying there at the beginning of Black Week. You were in King B that day, I believe, if all the records show correctly. And you had mentioned that one of your other dive crewmates also was sort of behind in the mission count, and that was Elder Dickinson, and he was flying ahead of you in Piccadilly Lily on the mission to Brennan. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you were in what was called?
He was on his 24th mission and was blown up in front of me. But I managed to corral the rest of the formation. We didn't lose but 7 airplanes out of the entire formation in the course of the mission. But at the time we turned on the bomb run on this particular mission, 12 airplanes out of the 18-plane formation were knocked out of the formation. I was the only flight leader, was flying with this new crew as a command pilot and instructor, teaching them what it was like to be in combat. And I was the only flight leader left airborne. So I fired a flare, and the other 5 ships that were still flyable formed on me, and we tacked on to the ensuing wave of bombers from the 95th group, who had lost an entire squadron, and that's the only way that we got back. But on that particular mission, the nose of the aircraft that I was flying was struck by an anti-aircraft charge, just like the picture of the Squawking Hawk. And I sat there for 5.5 hours with the cold wind blowing through and sustained the only physical damage that I endured in my entire tour, frostbitten feet. We had what we call 4 enemies. Flak, and we lost almost as many aircraft to flak as we did to fighters. We of course had the fighters, which were devastating. And we had freezing was the other. Black fighters and freezing. Those were our major enemies. If we could not identify the target visually under the rules of engagement, we weren't permitted to bomb. target and find it was obscured, the bombardier wasn't allowed to drop. We had to go to a secondary target. If that was also closed, and it often was, then we'd have to come back and drop our bombs in the channel. So we wouldn't be landing with them. Because landing with them while they're armed was a very dangerous practice. So we think that the English Channel today is literally paved with unexplored ordnance.
So now you can see a little bit this Black Week, beginning with what the losses Lucky just described, and just a couple days later, perhaps the 100th most notorious mission, where 13 planes went out and only one came back. Those sort of losses, by the end of October, were earning that bloody 100th reputation, that idea that somehow this group was cursed, that somehow this group was being singled out. It wasn't true, but after October, it did change the way those maximum effort missions were scheduled. And the philosophy from the top was, we can't keep doing this because the losses are unsustainable. I have a few statistics I'll show you here in just a moment. Sort of the rest of the story was Squawk and Hawk. Its 4 officers were out of commission because Sumner Reeder, even though he was the pilot, he had been hit by shrapnel from that exploding shell in the cockpit. He was unable to fly for over 4 months. But the enlisted men of Squawk and Hawk said, we want to stay together, and they were assigned to other pilots. On November 5th, their fate was sealed when 4 of them were up, not in Squawk and Hawk, but another plane, and that plane was battle damaged, and the pilot bailed them out over German territory. 1 evaded, 1 died. Connor Brewster, on the lower left, wearing a bandage, he had a bicycle accident. Lived a few more weeks only to succumb to his parachute not opening when he bailed out. 2, James Marasco and Frank Dolson ended up guests of the German Luftwaffe in a stall-up. Just to sort of close up a little more of the story, Sonny too became a victim of a wheels-up landing. Fortunately, Lucky wasn't in that one either. Another crew had taken it up as a one-time flight. They had made it back from their bombing mission in Germany, but were so damaged that they couldn't make it the whole way to Thorpe Abbotts. They came in wheels up near another base in England, and the plane was salvaged for parts. But soon there was a happy day. There was one man from the Squawk and Hawk crew, Bob Lovin, waist gunner, who completed his 25 missions. Lucky had an interlude from his flying of missions as a co-pilot and became an operations officer before reaching the 25th. And that made you the last member of Glenn Dye's crew, right? To complete your tour of duty at Thorpe Abbotts.
Yes, Dye finished, was the first crew in the 100 to finish and complete a 25 mission tour. But I only had 21 in at that time, so I still had 4 to go, and consequently was designated as an operations officer because of my senior position as having more missions than anybody on the base. But others, crewmen, were flying on ships and went down on their 24th or 25th mission. That was not uncommon. So you never knew until the last mission was over that you could come back and shake hands, kiss the ground, and thank God that you were still alive.
Here was, as the war resumed in 1944, and this is wrapping up the story of the original crews that went over there in May of 1943. By March, less than a year had passed. You had those new B-17G models that Lucky talked about. You had a new man in charge of operations, that was Jimmy Doolittle, and a new policy that said, we are sending our B-17s not by themselves into German airspace, but escorted by the powerful P-51 Mustang fighters. and that made a lot of difference. Right after the first raids on Germany, because the 100th was one of the first groups that got to Germany, Berlin, that is, the top brass, General Spaatz, General Doolittle, General LeMay, Kimmel, is that the third? There's a fourth general. They were all there. Lots of brass showed up at Thorpe Abbott's, and one of the things they did was present Sumner with his Distinguished Service Cross in person. Russ Engel, by that time, was already back home in the States. He had a new glass eye. He was training other navigators to go over. He received his Distinguished Service Cross rather unceremoniously one day by his commanding officer. He said, "Here, this came for you in the mail." Harry Eddie Burns' family was given a Distinguished Service Cross. They gathered at the little American Legion Hall in Harry's hometown for a ceremony. And then Squawk and Hawk had its own sort of high point. It became the first B-17 in the 100th Bomb Group to have survived 50 combat missions. And the day after it finished its 50th combat mission, they put up a sign and said, if you pay £1 British, you can paint your name on that aircraft that's going back to the United States for a bond tour. And I'm told that a lot of people from our 100th group could tell you exactly where they painted their name on the fuselage that day. A lot of the locals painted their names on the aircraft, and it did fly back here. And it did make a bond tour. Harry Eddie Burns' family was able to see the plane that Harry had flown. The ground crew sometimes gets overlooked as we tell stories from the cockpit and the gunners. Every person I've met in the 100th who was an officer said the ground crew deserves our undying thanks and praise and attention. This was the ground crew that proudly kept Squawk and Hawk going during its 50 combat missions and all the practice ones. And you see that as part of the tribute, the names of the original crew were painted on the rudder for the trip home. So you have been a wonderfully patient audience. I hope you have enjoyed hearing Lucky's first-hand stories, and maybe you've had a few dots connected in what you knew or didn't know about the operation of the Flying Fortress bomb group in combat England. What I can tell you is, if we look at just the Reader crew and the Die crew, the 20 men that went over there that Memorial Day weekend of 1943, a year later, there were 9 of them who would be able to say they completed their tour and came home. The others were casualties. They were out of the war, including Sumner Reader. He eventually was rotated out, sent home, was being groomed as a ferry pilot in a C-54. According to legend, he was being groomed as the personal pilot for General LeMay, who was headed to the Pacific. General LeMay was one of those generals in attendance the day his Distinguished Service Cross was pinned on. Remember that short snorter, that little short snorter of Harry's, 14 names, 100% of them in 5.5 months were casualties, no longer flying. And you wonder, when you see the overall statistic of those original crews, why would the name Bloody Hundredth be applied? And when you look at it just by the numbers, just by the stories you've heard from Lucky, maybe that makes a little more sense. Today we are proud to still be remembering those sacrifices. I talked about Thorpe Abbott's being a place you can go and experience today. It's in the upper right-hand corner. The Control Tower Museum has exhibits of some of the big battles and aircraft that you heard about today. There's an entire exhibit our friends have put together for Squawk and Hawk. Lucky is our tireless spokesperson, most recently appearing on the Smithsonian Channel right around Thanksgiving time. I know you're coming up in something else soon. You've been interviewed, you're on tape, so are our other veterans who are here today. And Masters of the Air, if you haven't heard about it, Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks and their production company are in the process of creating Yet another mini-series, very much like Band of Brothers was. Only this one tells the story of the Army Air Corps. And it is happening, and it is real. Lucky, I've heard it said that you still have a mission that you want to complete. And I put together this little collage of what I thought I've heard you talk about. And you call it Homefront Heroes Day.
Thank you, Chris. I'd love to. It seems very, very strange to me that we have Memorial Day to honor those who made the ultimate sacrifice in war. We have Veterans Day, where we celebrate the service of all of those in all branches who wore the uniform. We have the 4th of July, where we celebrate our freedoms that we think those of us who participated in the war preserved. But we have never, ever publicly recognized the tremendous contribution made to the war effort and still being made by civilians, those who stayed home and went into the factories and the offices and outproduced the world. They kept the home fires burning. Why don't we honor them? Why don't we have a day where we set aside and pay tribute to the absolutely remarkable contribution that they made to the war effort? Otherwise, we would not have prevailed in victory. We would never have made it. So I hope that you, in your individual capacities and locations around the country, will perhaps support our efforts to get a Congressional Day of proclamation of appreciation for the hometown heroes. And just as a postscript to complete the story, of those 40 of my classmates and I who went to the bloody 100th as co-pilots, 4 of us completed a tour. That will give you some idea of our loss factor. 10% survivors. So I am proud to have been a member of this organization from its origination or in the combat zone. I'm proud to have served my country. But I want to tell you in all honesty, we are not happy with the way the present generation is treating our freedoms. Thank you, and God bless America.
All right, everybody look forward. Albert, Al, look this way. There you go.